So you can get your Bibles out. Hopefully you can follow along there. We're going to pick up in the story where we left off, getting closer to the end of Jesus' life and his ministry. Only about 6 months now until the final Passover, and Jesus is making his way toward Jerusalem. He's traveling through Galilee and Samaria and Judea. He's teaching and preaching about the kingdom of God as he goes. And everywhere he goes, the crowds are getting bigger and bigger. Last week, we looked at a pretty interesting moment. The man in the crowd, remember, he interrupts Jesus with the whole, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." He wanted Jesus to step in and settle a family money dispute, but Jesus didn't do what the man asked. Instead, he used the moment to warn everyone about the danger of covetousness. There's a lot of warning going on in this passage that we're in. We're going to see that again today. But last week, the covetousness was the subject, the sneaky desire to always kind of want a little bit more for ourselves. Remember, Jesus told the story of the rich guy? The man who had already been blessed with tons, and then he got even more, and all he could think about was building bigger barns so he could relax and enjoy life. And then God called him a fool because that very night his life was taken from him, and all that he'd stored up for himself, none of it could save him. None of it was able to be kept. And from there, Jesus turned to his disciples then. He told them, don't live like that. Don't be anxious about your lives, about what you would eat or what they would wear. Remind them that their life is worth more than food and clothing. Their Father in heaven knows what they need. And then he gives them this promise in verse 32, where we left off last week. "Fear not, little flock, for it is the Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." That's where we ended last week. Jesus told the disciples, and he tells us, hey, we don't have to live in fear. We don't have to live anxiously trying to build up our own security and store up more and more for ourselves, because the kingdom already belongs to us, right? It's our Father's good pleasure to give it to us. So then the question becomes, if the kingdom is already ours, if God wants to give us the kingdom, how should we live in this kingdom and in anticipation of this kingdom? Well, that's what Jesus is answering more for us today. Beginning in verse 33, he's going to show us more about what it looks like to live as people who belong to the kingdom of God in this world. So verse 32, "Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys." Jesus drawing a pretty clear contrast here between two very different kinds of treasure. On the one hand, there's the kind of treasure that the rich fool is chasing, earthly treasure, the kind that can be lost and stolen and destroyed. It can be eaten by moths, taken by thieves, or simply just taken from us when we die. It's temporary, it's perishable. Back in verse 21, Jesus said that's exactly what the rich fool was doing. He's laying up treasure for himself, and in the end, he was not rich toward God. Now Jesus tells his disciples to pursue a different kind of treasure here, treasure in heaven, a treasure that cannot be lost or destroyed. It doesn't grow old, it can't be stolen, treasure that lasts forever. Notice how Jesus says we actually store up this heavenly treasure. He says, "Sell your possessions and give to the needy." In other words, when we're generous with what God has given us on earth, we are laying up treasure in heaven. When we open our hands and help those in need, we're not just giving something away, we're investing something that will last for eternity. It's a different way to think about what this world offers and the treasures in it. This is what it means to be rich towards God, right? It's not about us keeping more for ourselves. It's about us using what we have for God's purposes. Being generous, helping those who are struggling, and storing up something that will never fail. See, the rich fool, he tries to build security for himself by storing up more and more here on earth. Jesus says that kind of treasure doesn't last. Instead, he calls us to live differently, be generous with what we have here on earth, and in doing so, we store up treasure in heaven that we can never lose. So Jesus is really asking, what kind of treasure are you storing up? You're storing up one kind or the other. Are you living for the kind that can be lost or taken away? Or are you storing up treasure in heaven, the kind that lasts forever? Verse 34, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Pretty simple, but pretty powerful. Jesus is saying your heart always follows your treasure. Your heart is attached to your treasure. Whatever you value most, whatever you spend your life pursuing or protecting, that's where your heart's going to be. The rich fool from last week is a perfect example of this. His treasure was in his grain and his barns and his comfort. Because that's where his treasure was, that's where his heart was too. He lived for himself, he planned for himself, and in the end, he stood before God with nothing of lasting value. Jesus is calling us to something different. He's saying if we want our hearts to be in the right place, then we need to put our treasure in the right place. When we store up treasure in heaven by being generous, by helping those in need, by living for the kingdom instead of ourselves, then our hearts will follow our treasure. Our hearts will be set on things that actually matter, things that last. That's why Jesus warns us so strongly about the covetousness and anxiety just in the preceding verses. Both of those things can pull our hearts towards earthly treasure so easily, towards things that can be lost and taken away. But when we live generously and store up treasure in heaven, our hearts are pulled in a completely different direction, is the idea. They're pulled toward God, towards the things that will never fade. So Jesus is really giving us a test here, actually. He's saying, look where your treasure is, because that's where you're going to find your heart. He invites us to put our treasure in the right place so that our hearts will be set on the right things. So you can't have it both ways, right? We've heard this several times already in the story. Either your heart is set towards the things of God or your heart is set on the things of this earth. Jesus is making it clear that our hearts will follow whatever we treasure most. We can't live with one foot in the kingdom and one foot in the world. We can't store up treasures for ourselves here on earth at the same time expecting our hearts to be fully devoted to God. One or the other. It's something that God has always made clear to his people. All the way back in the Old Testament, Joshua challenged the people of Israel with these words, "Choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Later, as Elijah stood before the people on top of Mount Carmel, he said, "How long will you go limping between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him." God's never been interested in a divided heart. He wants all of us. And Jesus is given the same thing here in Luke 12. You can't love, you can't serve both God and money. You can't treasure both things of this world and the things of heaven at the same time. Your heart will always follow what you treasure most. So the question Jesus is really asking them and us is, where's your heart? Because wherever your heart is, wherever your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Proverbs 4:23, keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life. This is what Jesus is talking about, making sure your hearts are in the right place. This is the first thing that Jesus said. If your heart's not in the right place, then nothing else will matter. And then Jesus warns them and us, where is your treasure? Your heart is where your treasure is. Verse 35, so stay dressed for action. Keep your lamps burning. Two phrases paint a picture of readiness, is the idea. Jesus is describing the posture that we should have as we wait for his return. We shouldn't be worried about the Pharisees and our opposition. We shouldn't be worried about anxiety and the things of this world. We shouldn't be storing up treasure for ourselves. We should set our hearts on God, and we should stay dressed for action and keep our lamps burning. What's that mean? He says, stay dressed for action. This is a pretty common expression back then. Might have girded. It might be a word that's used in your Bible. Girded for service. Back in Exodus chapter 12, on the very night of the Passover, remember this story? God told the Israelites to eat the meal with their belts fastened and their sandals on their feet and their staff in hand. They were to eat in haste, ready to leave Egypt the moment God gave the command. They're not to be relaxed. They're not to be casual. They're to be dressed and prepared to move. It's a term that means ready to serve. Girded is, like I said, the old word for it, girded for service. So when Jesus says, stay dressed for action, he's using that same kind of picture. He's telling his disciples and us to live with that same posture of readiness. Don't get spiritually lazy. Live as servants who are dressed and ready to serve the master at any moment. And he adds, keep your lamps burning. Well, in those days, if you wanted light at night, you had to keep an oil lamp going. You just couldn't light it once and then forget about it either. You had to keep tending it and making sure there was enough oil, trimming the wick, all of that stuff. Any neglect of the lamp, it would go out, leave you in the dark. So when Jesus says, keep your lamps burning, he's calling us to stay spiritually alert and prepared. What about remember this? You ever heard of burning the midnight oil? Yeah, that's also incorporated in this idea of keep your lamps burning. Stay up, stay awake, study. Working by lamplight while others are sleeping is the idea. Picture of diligence and watchfulness. Jesus is saying, hey, don't let your spiritual life grow dim. Stay awake, keep feeding the flame. Don't drift off while others around you are spiritually sleeping. So you put those two together, it gives a pretty clear picture. Jesus saying, hey, be ready. Be dressed and prepared to serve. And be spiritually awake and diligent, like someone who is willing to burn the midnight oil to stay ready for the master's return. This is the posture, readiness, as we wait for the master's return. Because we don't know when Jesus is coming back. Could be soon, could be a while. Either way, we're called to live ready. Not drifting, not spiritually asleep, but dressed for action with lamps burning. So he doesn't stop there. He goes on to verse 36. Gives us another picture, helps us understand what readiness should look like. He says, and be like men who are waiting for their master to come home from the wedding feast, so that they may open the door to him at once when he comes and knocks. So Jesus is using the image of servants waiting for their master to return from a wedding. And so in that day, the servants would have no idea when their master was coming home. Email wasn't quite working yet. They wouldn't know the day. They wouldn't know the hour. He'd just come when he comes. Weddings could last many days sometimes, and then travel to and from them. So the master could return early in the evening. He could come home very late. There's just no way for the servants to know. So, because of that, the servants, what do they have to do? They have to stay ready all the time. They couldn't afford to get lazy or fall asleep on the job. They needed to be alert and prepared so that whenever the master did return and call on them, they could spring into action right away. Whether opening the door when he knocked or attending whatever needs he had, or they're just ready to serve at a moment's notice is the idea. That's the kind of readiness Jesus is calling us to. Not just about being ready for his final return, though that is certainly included. It's also about living with a daily posture of readiness to serve him whenever he calls on us. We're to be like those servants, dressed for action with our lamps burning and ready to respond the moment the master speaks. Jesus doesn't want his followers to be spiritually lazy or distracted. He wants us to live as servants who are alert and prepared to serve him in whatever way he asks, whenever he asks it. Whether that's today, tomorrow, or when he finally returns, it doesn't matter. So Jesus promises, verse 37, blessed are those servants who the master finds awake when he comes. The word awake here, it means more than just not being asleep. It carries the idea of being watchful and alert. It describes someone who's paying attention, staying ready, not drifting into distraction. Jesus is saying that the person who's living with this kind of watchfulness is blessed. There's a special blessing, a real happiness for the one who is found ready when the master returns. They're not caught off guard. They've been living with their eyes open and their hearts prepared. And because of that, they receive a blessing. Kind of an encouragement and a challenge at the same time, is it not? Jesus is showing us here that there's a blessing in living ready. And it's not just about avoiding trouble. It's about living in such a way that brings joy to the master and results in blessing when he returns. What's the blessing? What does this blessedness look like for those who stay alert and on guard, those who are watchful? Verse 37 again, blessed are those servants to whom the master finds awake when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will dress himself for service and have them recline at the table, and he will come and serve them. Wow, pretty surprising picture here. In that culture, it would have been almost unheard of for a master to serve his servants. The master was the one who gave the orders. The master was the one who was served. Servants waited on the master, not the other way around. Jesus says that when the master returns and finds his servants awake and ready, when he returns, something remarkable happens. The master doesn't just thank them or give them a pat on the back. He actually serves them. He dresses himself for service. He has them recline at the table, and he waits on them. This is Jesus' way of showing us just how great the blessing is for those who are faithful and watchful. It's not a small reward. It's not just escaping judgment. It's receiving personal honor and blessing from the Master himself. Jesus is saying that those who live ready, those who stay spiritually awake and alert, will one day be honored in a way that goes far beyond anything that they could expect. Pretty encouraging and sobering at the same time. Encouraging because it shows us that Jesus sees and values faithfulness. He doesn't take it for granted when his people stay ready and watchful and waiting. But it's also a challenge because it reminds us of how we live matters. Jesus is coming back, and when he does, he wants to find us awake, not spiritually asleep, not distracted, not lazy. So the question for us is, are we living in such a way that we would be ready if Jesus returned today? Are we the kind of servants he would find awake and watchful? Verse 38, if he comes in the second watch or in the third watch and finds them awake, blessed are those servants. In those days, the night was divided into watches, periods of time when guards and servants would stay alert, 4 watches. And the second and third watches would have been the middle of the night, the hours when most people would be tired and tempted to fall asleep. Jesus is making a point here. The master might not come back early. He might not come back at a convenient time. He can come in the middle of the night or even later when everyone is weary and it's hardest to stay awake. But the blessing is still there for those servants who are found ready even in the late hours. In other words, Jesus is calling us not just to initial readiness, but to a continued persevering readiness. It's one thing to be excited and alert at the beginning. It's another thing to be watchful and faithful when time has passed and it feels like the master has been delayed. Jesus is saying that those who stay awake and ready, even when it's late, even when it's hard, even when others have grown tired or distracted, those servants are blessed. There's a special blessing for those who don't give up, who don't grow spiritually lazy, but who keep their hearts ready no matter how long the wait might be. Jesus gives another picture here now to drive the point home even further. He says in verse 39, but know this, that if the master of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have left his house to be broken into. Makes sense. No one knows when a thief is going to break into their house. If they did, they'd stay up and be ready for them. They wouldn't go to bed and leave the house unprotected. But because the thief comes unexpectedly, that's what catches people off guard. Jesus says in verse 40, so you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. It's the heart of what Jesus has been saying here. Just like a thief comes when people are not expecting it, Jesus will return at a time that no one knows it. Because we don't know when he's coming, we must live ready. That's the point. Jesus connects these two ideas here, being awake and being ready. These are closely related. Back in 37, he said, blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. Now he said, you must also be ready. Being awake, staying spiritually alert and watchful is what prepares us to be ready for Jesus' return. And you really can't be ready if you're asleep. The two don't go together. So the idea is Jesus coming is like a thief is picked up again in the New Testament. You might be familiar with this. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, Apostle Paul writes, for you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. He goes on to encourage the believers, brothers, you are not in darkness for that day to surprise you like a thief, though. So let us not sleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. Paul's saying the same thing Jesus is saying here. Because we don't know when the Lord will return, we're called to stay spiritually awake until he does. We're not to live like the rest of the world, distracted, spiritually asleep, unprepared. Instead, we're to live alert and ready. That's why Jesus says, you must also be ready. It's not a suggestion. It's a command. Because Jesus could return at any time, we're called to live with our hearts awake, our lives prepared, not drifting through life, spiritually asleep, living watchful, ready for the day when the Son of Man returns. Verse 41, Peter said, Lord, are you telling this parable for us or for all? Kind of weird, eh? It just comes kind of out of the blue. What are you talking about, Peter? Interesting question. Makes me wonder, why did Peter ask this? Well, there might be a few reasons. For one, Peter often spoke up as the representative of the disciples. He may have simply wanted to know how directly this teaching was to be applied to them. Maybe. Was Jesus speaking to everyone in general, or was he giving specific instructions just to the 12? Might be something more going on here, though. We know from other places in the Gospels that the disciples are sometimes, struggling with thoughts about their own importance and position. I've heard this story before a few times. They had arguments about who among them was the greatest. So when Peter asked this question, is it possible he's also wondering whether Jesus is something more specific or more elevated for them as his disciples? Something that set them apart because they're his closest followers. Maybe Peter's thinking, hey, Jesus, we left everything to follow you. We know better than anyone else. Of course we're going to be watchful. Of course we're going to be ready for your return. Is there something more for us? Is it just being watchful? That's it? Maybe that's what's going on. But whatever's going through Peter's mind, Jesus doesn't exactly answer yes or no, notice. Instead, he tells another story. This time about a manager, or actually a couple of managers, who are put in charge of the master's household. And in this parable, I think Jesus shifts the focus from general readiness to something a bit more specific, faithfulness and responsibility. Seems Jesus is saying, what I just taught about being ready applies to everyone, but now I want to say something to you as well. Those who have been given greater responsibility, those who know me a bit better. Of course, we know that all of this applies to everyone anyway, but he's got something to say here. So he's going to tell another story, another parable. This one not just servants, but about managers of servants. And Jesus is going to contrast two different household managers. Here's what Jesus says about the first manager, verse 42. And the Lord said, who then is the faithful and wise manager whom his master will set over his household to give them their portion of food at the proper time? It's kind of a rhetorical question. Jesus isn't really looking for an answer from the crowd here. He knows. He's using the question to describe the kind of person he has in mind. He's basically asking, what kind of servant would a master trust enough to put in charge of his whole household? Notice this manager isn't just another servant. He's been given real responsibility. The manager has set him over his household. That means he's been given authority and oversight. He's not just responsible for himself anymore. Now he's responsible for others. He's been entrusted with the care of the master's servants. And what's his main job? Jesus says it's to give them their portion of food at the proper time. It's important. Faithful manager just doesn't sit back and enjoy his position. His role is to make sure the other servants are properly cared for. He's responsible to see that they receive what they need when they need it. He's not just using his position for his own benefit. He's using it to serve and provide for the others. This gives us a picture of what faithful leadership looks like in the kingdom of God, does it not? It's not about having a title or being in charge for your own sake. It's about being trustworthy with the responsibility you've been given. A good manager doesn't neglect the people under his care. He doesn't use his authority to control or take advantage of others. Instead, he faithfully looks after them and makes sure they're provided for, just like the master would want. So when Jesus asks, who then is the faithful and wise manager, he's describing someone who's been given oversight and who carries out that responsibility with care and with faithfulness. He's not just watching for the master's return for his own sake, he's also making sure the rest of the household is ready and cared for while the master's away. Verse 43, blessed is that servant whom his master will find doing so when he comes. So after describing the faithful and wise manager in verse 42, Jesus now pronounces a blessing on that kind of servant. That word blessed here carries the idea of being favored or approved by the master. It's more than just being happy. It means the master looks with approval and blesses this servant. Notice what Jesus says. The blessing is for the servant who the master finds so doing when he comes. Again, pointing back to verse 42. This is the servant who has faithfully been giving the other servants their portion of food at the proper time. He hasn't been neglecting his responsibilities or using his position for his own comfort. Instead, he's been steadily and faithfully caring for the master's household while the master's been away. It's important. Jesus isn't talking about someone who started well or had good intentions. He's talking about a servant who is still faithfully doing his job when the master finally returns. It's ongoing faithfulness and perseverance, not just a one-time effort. The blessing comes to the one who keeps serving faithfully even when the master has been gone for a while and no one is closely watching anymore. We see some examples of this kind of faithfulness in the Old Testament. With Joseph, remember his story? Yeah, Joseph was put in charge of Potiphar's household. And later he's given responsibility over the prison. In both situations, he remains faithful even when those in authority were absent or unaware. Joseph refused to do wrong both to Potiphar or to Pharaoh when he had the chance. He didn't take advantage of his position or neglect his responsibilities. He continued to faithfully care for what had been entrusted to him. Jesus is a picture of a kind of servant Jesus describes here in Luke 12. Someone who stays faithful and continues doing his job well, even when the master seems to be far away. Jesus is showing here there's a real blessing for this kind of ongoing faithfulness. He doesn't take it for granted that when his people continue to serve him faithfully over time, there's approval and blessing from him for the servant who's found awake and doing what he's supposed to be doing. At the same time, it's also a challenge. Reminds us that how we live while we wait matters. Jesus is coming back. And when he does, he wants to find us faithfully carrying out the responsibilities he's given us, not spiritually asleep, not distracted, and not using our position for selfish reasons. So the question this verse leaves with us, if Jesus were to return today, would he find us faithfully doing what he's called us to do? I hope so. Because look what Jesus says the master's response to such servants will be. Verse 44, truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. Remarkable. Jesus says the master will take the faithful servant and put him in charge of everything. Significant promotion. The servant who is faithful with the responsibility he'd been given is now entrusted with even greater responsibility. Not just a small reward, not just a pat on the back. The master is saying, in effect, because you were faithful with what I gave you, I'm going to give you even more. I'm going to trust you with greater authority and greater responsibility. It's a pretty powerful picture of how God works, is it not? When we are faithful with his responsibilities he gives us, whether they're big or small, he'll entrust us with more. Faithfulness in the little things leads to greater opportunities to serve. Jesus is showing us that our faithfulness now matters. Not just for the blessing it brings when he returns, but also because it prepares us for greater responsibilities for him in the kingdom. Encourages us to, because it shows us that Jesus sees and rewards faithfulness, and he doesn't overlook the quiet, consistent service of those who keep doing what they're called to do. It also is a challenge, though, because it reminds us how we handle these responsibilities we have right now really does matter. God is watching, and he's looking for servants he can trust with more. So as we think about this, we're reminded once again that living ready isn't just about waiting for Jesus to come back. It's also about being faithful with whatever he has entrusted to us in the meantime, whether that's leading others, caring for others, teaching, serving, or simply being faithful in our everyday lives. Back to the question in verse 41. Who then is the faithful and wise manager whom this master will set over his household? Well, we heard the positive answer, the one who's ready and awake and helping others to stay ready and awake. That's the kind of servant I'm looking for, Jesus says. That's the kind of servant that gets rewarded. But, verse 45, but if that servant says to himself, my master is delayed in coming, and begins to beat the male and female servants, and to eat and drink and get drunk. Notice how this begins. The servant says to himself, my master is delayed in coming. Kind of that internal reasoning thing again. Saw that before. Once he convinces himself that the master isn't coming back anytime soon, changes how he lives. He stops living as someone who will one day have to give an account. Instead, he begins to use his position for his own selfish purposes, just like the rich man. Right? That we saw back in verse 19, that man who also talked to himself said, "Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry." He convinced himself that he could live however he wanted because he believed he had secured his future. So in both cases, the rich fool and this unfaithful servant, they use their own reasoning to justify living for themselves. Way of thinking is not new. We see something really similar in the Old Testament in Exodus chapter 32. While Moses is up on the Mount Sinai, receiving the law from God, he was gone for a long time. 40 days and 40 nights. And the people begin to grow restless. And what do they say? "We do not know what has become of him," because they thought Moses was delayed or possibly not coming back. And they turned away from the Lord in just that time. They pressured Aaron to make a golden calf so they could worship it. A delay became an excuse for them to live however they wanted, to do what they thought was best. Same kind of thinking shows up again in the New Testament. In 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter warns us that in the last days, scoffers will come who say, "Where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation." These people, Peter warns us, will mock the idea that Jesus is returning, using the fact that time has passed as an excuse to live however they want. Dangerous reasoning, especially when we see the unfaithful servant here in Luke 12. He says to himself, "My master is delayed in coming," and that thought gives him permission to stop being faithful. Instead of caring for the other servants, he begins to beat them, both the male and the female servants. He abuses the very people he's supposed to be looking after, is the idea. And instead of staying faithful to his responsibilities, he starts to eat and drink and get drunk and live for his own pleasure as if there will never be any consequences for his actions, as if the master's not coming back. Pretty tragic picture of what can happen when someone stops living with the reality of the master's return in view. The unfaithful servant didn't start out beating the other servants. He got there because he first convinced himself that the master was delayed and that he could live however he wanted. And Jesus is going to describe what will happen to this unfaithful servant. He says in verse 46, "The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful." Pretty sobering picture. The master returns at a time the servant is not expecting, and all of the servants' self-indulgent and abusive behavior, beating the other servants and living for his own pleasure, it comes to a sudden and terrible halt. Notice that Jesus says the master will come on a day when he does not expect him and at an hour he does not know. Directly confronts the servant's earlier reasoning. He had said to himself, "My master is delayed in coming," and he uses that thought to justify his unfaithfulness, but the master does come, and he comes when the servant least expects it. Judgment's severe. Jesus says the master will cut him in pieces. Pretty strong language. Describes a harsh and final judgment. And then he adds that the servant will be put with the unfaithful. In other words, he'll be grouped together with those who have rejected their master and his authority entirely. He will share their fate. Again, serious warning. The unfaithful servant was given real responsibility. He was put in charge of the master's household and the other servants. But instead of being faithful with that responsibility, he used it for his own selfish gain, even harmed those under his care. And when the master finally returns, there's no escape from the consequences. And he's not pleased. Pretty sharp contrast to the faithful manager we looked at earlier, eh? The guy found doing what he was supposed to be doing. He's rewarded with great responsibility, great opportunity. But this guy is found abusing his position, and he faces some pretty severe judgment. And it's important to notice, both the faithful manager and the unfaithful manager are surprised when the master returns. Both servants face the same situation. The sudden and unexpected return of the master comes upon them. And what makes the difference is how they've lived while the master has been away. The faithful servant has been awake and ready and caring for the master's household. The unfaithful servant has been living as if the master would never come back. When the master finally appears, one is blessed and the other is judged. Highlights a pretty important truth, Jesus' teaching. The timing of the master's return is the same for everyone. It'll be unexpected. The outcome is very different depending on whether the servant has been faithful or unfaithful. The faithful servant is blessed and rewarded, while the unfaithful servant is severely judged. It's a helpful reminder, is it not? This life is not about, readiness is not about knowing the timing of Jesus' return exactly. It's about how we live in light of the fact that the master could return at any time. We don't have to figure out when he's coming. We're simply called to live faithfully and watchfully while we wait for his coming. So Jesus is going to clearly delineate two different paths for those who would be managers of God's household. Verse 47, and that servant who knew his master's will but did not get ready or act according to his will receive a severe beating. But the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. I like these verses about beatings. Where's the no beating option? That's what I want to know. Jesus is making it clear that greater knowledge brings greater responsibility. That's what's going on here. The servant who knew what his master wanted but chose not to prepare or obey gets a more severe judgment, beating, because he can't claim ignorance. He knew what was expected of him, and he deliberately chose not to act on it. Now Jesus adds a layer of understanding. He acknowledges that there are some who sin without full knowledge. Their judgment, their beating will be lighter. That's the point. God's paying attention. He knows what's in your heart and mind. Jesus says the more willful a person's rejecting of God is, the more willful the disobedience to him, the greater the consequences. Verse 48, Jesus tells them all, everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required. And from him to whom they entrusted much, they will demand the more. Jesus is saying very clearly, the more we've been given, whether it's knowledge, responsibility, resources, influence, doesn't matter. The more we've been given, the more God expects from us. Greater privilege brings greater accountability. That's why the unfaithful manager in this parable is judged so severely, right? He was given real responsibility over the master's household. He knew what was expected of him, but he chose to live for himself anyway. This principle is encouraging and a bit worrying. It's encouraging because it shows us that God notices and values faithfulness. But it's hard because it's a reminder we cannot treat lightly the gifts and blessings that God has given us, can we? The more we've been entrusted with, the more he's given us, the more he wants us to use that to look after his household for him. Pretty serious word Jesus delivers here. Pretty serious consequences at stake for the servants of the master, eh? I would think words like this could cause some pretty serious reflection. How has my service to the household of the master been as I've been waiting? A lot of things can go through our heads. What haven't I done enough of? What should I be doing? How can I make sure I'm not in for a beating, severe or not? Those are all good questions to ask ourselves. 2 Corinthians 13:5 says, examine yourselves to see whether you're in the faith. Test yourselves. Philippians 2:12 says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Let me just point out two, I think, pretty encouraging things as we close here. What is the main thing that Jesus is asking his disciples for here? Who are the blessed servants in this story? Go back to verse 37 for a second. Blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. Jesus isn't saying the blessed servants are the ones who've never made a mistake. He's not saying that they're the ones who got everything perfectly right. He says they're the ones who stayed awake. They stayed watchful. They didn't drift off spiritually. They didn't get so distracted by life that they forgot what was really going on. That's the main thing Jesus is looking for, apparently. He wants servants who stay awake. Servants who remember that the master is coming back. Servants who don't let themselves fall asleep spiritually while they're waiting for it. It's actually pretty encouraging when you think about it. Jesus isn't asking us to be perfect. He's not asking us to have everything figured out. He's asking us to stay awake, to stay alert, to keep our hearts ready. To not get so caught up in the things of this world that we forget the most important thing, that Jesus is coming back and we belong to him. That's the other encouraging thing to remember. What does Jesus say is going to happen to the awake servants when the master returns and finds them ready? Verse 37, truly I say to you, he will dress himself for service and have them recline at the table, and he will come and serve them. Who's the master in this story? It's a parable, right? Parables, somebody represents something. The master, it's Jesus. He's the one who went away for a while and who will one day return. And what does he say he will do for his faithful servants when he comes back and finds them? He will serve them. Yes, keep staying awake and ready is sometimes difficult. Being faithful servants of the King in this world is not easy. But let's remember who the real servant is. It's not us, it's Jesus. He is the faithful servant who is always found ready and always about his Father's business. And it's his heart to serve his people. See it clearly just a few months from now, on the night before he goes to the cross. As Jesus and his disciples gather for the Passover meal, he gets up from the table and he takes off his outer garment and he washes their feet. The job of a servant. And then as they eat together, he tells them that he's about to offer his own body and blood for them so that they can be washed clean forever. Then he serves them the cup and the bread. Then he also tells them something else. He says that there's another meal still to come, a future meal he's looking forward to sharing with them in his Father's kingdom. He says, I tell you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. This is the meal Jesus has in mind. That's the table he wants to serve his people at. Prophet Isaiah wrote, on this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine. He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord will wipe away tears from all faces. And it will be said on that day, behold, this is our God. We have waited for him that he might save us. This is the Lord. We have waited for him. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. That's what's in store for the faithful. Thanks to our King, that's what's in store for all of us. So no matter what's going on today or tomorrow in your life or in this world, stay awake, stay ready, stay dressed for action, and keep your lamps burning. That's what he wants. The master is coming back. When he does, he'll take his rightful place as king and everything will change.